Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's FP Virtual Dialogue, Demographic Realities, the Truth About Global Population Trends. I'm Dr. Maisha Alam, Senior Vice President of Research at Foreign Policy, and it's my pleasure to be your moderator today. Before diving in, I'd like to extend a big thanks to the Population Institute for helping us make today's event possible. Contrary to common misconceptions, the world's population is not on the verge of collapse. In fact, the world's population continues to grow, with projections estimating the global population will be 8.5 billion by 2030 and 9.6 billion in 2050. Indeed, to coincide with today's event, I'm excited to launch a new insight brief called Demographic Realities and Population Trends, Ensuring Choice, Equity, and Access in an Era of Transition, from FP Analytics, the independent research division of the FP Group, produced with support from the Population Institute. As our research shows, population trends vary widely across regions and countries, with significant implications for national economies, healthcare systems, and social protection infrastructure. Additionally, policies on gender equality, family planning, and migration continue to shape population dynamics, and population trends are deeply intertwined with broader social, economic, and environmental challenges. Understanding these relationships and patterns offers valuable insights into how nations can respond to and invest in the evolving needs of their populations. Today's discussion on the eve of World Population Day brings together expert leaders and changemakers to explore population trends, their drivers, and their impacts, including as relates to reproductive autonomy, gender equality, and economic opportunity. And of course, I'm sure I'm not the only one with questions. We also want to hear from you, our global audience, who are tuned in and watching our live streams on social media. Here's how to write to us. If you're watching the live stream on our website, click the button below to submit your questions. Please be sure to tell us your name, organization, and where you're writing from. If you're joining us on social media, you can chime in by tagging @foreignpolicy, or you can email us your questions to events@foreignpolicy.com. All right, let's get started. To begin today's program, I'm honored to welcome Dr. Alessio Cangiano, Acting Chief of the Population and Development Branch Program Division at the UN Population Fund, UNFPA, and Aparna Mehrotra, Director of System Coordination Division and Senior Executive Advisor on Aging at UN Women. Welcome, Alessio and Aparna. Thank you so much for joining us today. All right, well, let's dive in. And Alessio, I'd love to begin the conversation with you. The newly released State of the World Population Report from UNFPA offers important insights into the patterns and drivers of declining fertility. What are some of the most significant findings of the report, and how should they inform how we talk about and think about population at a global level?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks so much for this opportunity to contribute to this very important conversation. The report addresses what is increasingly characterized as a fertility crisis or a depopulation crisis, as you mentioned. Its main argument is that birth rates are falling not because people don't want to have children anymore, but because they are unable to have the children they want. And that is the real crisis. While women and young people are increasingly portrayed as, or even blamed for rejecting parenthood, and we see that in a lot of media, for example, the findings of the report show that most people want to have children, but face insurmountable challenges, including high cost of living, sexist norms, feeling of precarity and uncertainty about the future. We conducted the global survey. We surveyed about 10,000 respondents across 14 countries. We found that what people want in most cases is to have 2 children Desired family size is surprisingly similar across different contexts. And yet 1 in 5 people expect to not achieve their desired family size. Most people, they expect to underachieve their family size, and some people even expect to overachieve their family size. And this is because essentially societies are not providing the conditions for people to exercise true choice over what is one of the most consequential decisions in their lives. Economic barriers are mentioned as the number one issue. More than half of respondents said that economic issues, finances, job security, housing were a factor in having fewer children than they wanted. Almost a quarter said that health issues were a factor. And 1 in 5 people say wars, pandemics, politics, and climate change are a fact. Gender equality inequality deepens the crisis. Unpaired caregiving, unequal domestic roles are key drivers of underachieved fertility goals. We know that women still do 3 to 10 times more unpaid domestic and childcare work than men. 11% said they lack a partner involvement in care. 14% of survey respondents said they won't have the number of children they want because they lack a partner or a suitable partner. The report argues that this can be more broadly characterized as a crisis of reproductive agency, because 1 in 3 survey respondents also say that they experienced unintended pregnancies. And 1 in 4 experienced a time when they wanted to have children but were unable to. Same-sex couples, single people, migrants, other marginalized groups are also often excluded, particularly vulnerable to exclusion to fulfilling their parenthood expectations. We looked at the policies aimed at influencing fertility rates and find that they are largely failing. Many governments are adopting financial incentives, such as one-time baby bonuses with a stated intent to boost fertility rates. These actions are generally ineffective because in isolation, they cannot meet the financial needs of raising a child over a lifetime. Some governments are even taking restrictive measures that limit people's choices, such as banning comprehensive sexuality education in schools, restricting access to contraception, limiting or criminalizing access to abortion services. And these measures are also counterproductive, worsening the problem they are trying to solve and leading to unintended consequences, such as increasing maternal mortality, secondary infertility, but also more pessimistic views about the future. And we know from the past that this kind of approaches can lead to coercion and human rights violations.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I think you've touched on some really important and complex issues, Alessio. And, I'd love to pick up on a few of the points that you raised and Aparna, bring you into the conversation. Just building on what Alessio was just talking about, we know that population trends are deeply connected to gender equality and bodily autonomy. And the recent report from UNFPA certainly reinforces that. How can we ensure that policy responses to demographic change recognize the full arc of women's lives, including the voices, contributions, and rights of older women who are so often invisibilized? Aparna, could you unmute yourself, please?
Yeah, okay, here I go.
Great.
So, what can I tell you? I think it's, everything you've heard up to now is absolutely on target. And I'm going to just focus on a little bit on the, older women angle of it. Because if we don't look at the entire arc, as you said, I think we will have a lot to lose. And when you look at societies, whether they're youth bulges today, they will be aging bulges soon enough, or they're already suffering aging bulges or experiencing rather aging bulges. So I think behind every demographic trend, there lies a sort of deeper human story. And it's really more often than not a gendered one. In fact, it's always a gendered one. So let me just share with you a few numbers so that you get the picture. You know, in 2050, people age 60 plus will double to 2.1 billion, and women will be a majority of these. So we're not talking about a few million, we're talking about a billions, you know, of women. And they have longer life expectancies. They, the statistics tell you it, to varying degrees, women will suffer more poverty than men, and they will have poorer health outcomes than men. So, you know, there is a need to focus on this population in particular, talking of the arc of human existence. No, then we have 1 in 3. The statistic gets even worse. It's 1 in 3 are over 50 by the age of 2050, and yet, you know, longer lives, they live longer, but it's not translating into better lives. You know, the gender gaps that they have experienced throughout their life actually accumulate, and then they manifest with much greater intensity in older age. So they have lower pensions, their healthcare outcomes are worse, their unpaid caregiving compounds, but then when they need care, then sometimes they're alone. And there's increasing poverty, as I said earlier. Now, on the other side, you know, instead of looking at the sort of negative story here, there's also a positive story, but it has to be recognized and made visible. You know, just think about it. 16.4 billion hours of unpaid work are done daily by women. They sustain families, they sustain economies, and yet it's nowhere reflected in GDP. And because of the universally accepted fact of ageism, especially older women are invisibilized. And I think it's worth re-mentioning this. You know, ageism is the most widely accepted bias universally in every country. So this is, you know, the stark reality that we face. And there's some 2 or 3 other tendencies that add to this that I think should be mentioned to provide a complete picture. One is urbanization. Urbanization is proceeding at a fast pace. And in fact, urbanization is understood to be one of the 5 megatrends in addition to demographic shifts. And what happens there? You know, urbanization remains gender blind, and you have women contribute, you know, being put at greater risk in many situations. And they also have to access the formal workforce sometimes when they're urbanized. And all of that is much more difficult for them. So then there's migration, which shapes demographics. So migrant women are actually community builders, and that requires a recognition which is not afforded to them. You know, you just look at certain countries which have had wars, and you look at all the population that is emigrated from those countries and have become migrants in other countries, and the entire burden of is shifted to the women. So, and then finally, I think there's another trend which we somehow was alluded to perhaps, but that's the changing family structures. You know, there's delayed marriage, there's lower fertility, and there are diverse household forms. And all of this, you know, together, it requires very deliberate approaches. It requires a deliberate understanding, a deliberate policy focus, and put together, I think all of this contributes to the reproductive agency, because, you know, there's a limit to how much any individual is going to accept challenge. So if you are burdening women in particular with challenge, then they're naturally going to make choices which maybe they would rather not make, but that they feel they must make because they understand or inherently, intrinsically feel the difficulty of their daily lives. So
Yeah.
I think this is something that, you know, it's an angle that is not always brought up. And I feel that it's very important when you look at gender equality and you look at the aging bulge, which will sooner or later affect everybody.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I
um,
appreciate that so much, Aparna. The way that you pulled those pieces together and those threads that, as you very rightly pointed out, are interrelated, but all too often considered in silos. And the other thing that you touched upon is about the megatrends. And I'd love to ask a question to both of you, actually, from your vantage points at UNFPA and UN Women, respectively. Global demographic change, as both of you alluded to, is one of the UN's five core megatrends, shaping everything from labor markets to climate resilience to healthcare and migration. So, how do you see the role of the UN and of multilateral institutions more broadly in guiding the global response in terms of where do we go from here? And maybe, Alicia, we can go with you first, and then Aparna, I'll come to you after that. But Alicia, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, let me start by saying, and working at UNFPA, one of the things we do is supporting countries in collecting demographic data and conducting demographic analysis and projecting their future demographic trends. This is very important. It's one of the pillars for better understanding the implications of demographic change. And this is not straightforward. Population data systems are often poorly funded and deprioritized. The last round of population and housing censuses, for example, globally only covered 70% of the world population. So we couldn't count almost 30% of the population globally. How can you design good policies if you don't even know how many people live in your country, let alone who they are? So the UN has definitely a role to play in strengthening this capacity, mobilizing resources to support countries in this exercise. And this is not just about counting people. Again, as I mentioned, is projecting demographic trends into the future. This is something, demography is something that is highly predictable over a relatively short time frame of, let's say, 20, 30 years. So that means countries have time to look into the future, see what's coming up, and adapt their systems and institutions to respond to demographic change. So this is part of the work that we do as UNFPA. More broadly, as the UN system, I think it's very important that we work jointly to promote the foundational and normative principles upon which responses to demographic change should be based. The fact that they should be people-centered, they should be human rights-based, they should promote equality and empowerment, they should promote intergenerational solidarity, inclusion. These are all foundational principles that are at the core of the normative work of the UN and that are essential to be integrated in responses to demographic change. Of course, the other thing we do is to try to promote international cooperation, maximizing synergies across countries, but also developing some global policy frameworks and solutions for global phenomena, for global megatrends. Aparna has mentioned very relevant one, migration, that basically no country can fully address or manage in isolation.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I appreciate those very concrete sort of pathways as you've highlighted. Aparna, let's hear from you on this. Over to you.
Well, you're talking to somebody who absolutely defends multilateralism because multilateralism, is a framework. And it's one of the few ways that you get the entire set of, in the case of the UN, 193 countries to actually talk to each other, come up with some sort of common framework, and generally have some standards which serve as North Stars to then accelerate progress or drive the whole world in the same direction to some extent. And progress is uneven everywhere, but for every framework. But nonetheless, it's a harmonized and civilized, let me say, agreement as to standards in a range of areas. And when we speak of multilateralism, I think it's really important to understand that the world's highest standard setting body is the United Nations. And every single mandate, whether it's UNICEF for children, UN Women for women's rights, ICAO for civil aviation, etc., or ITU for telecommunications, we have to understand that this is what the UN really does. It's a standard setting body. So when it comes to the issue of demographic shift, what are some of the standards when it's looked at through the lens of gender? One is our blueprint, which is called the Beijing Platform for Action, and it was negotiated in 1995. But if you read the Platform for Action, it's got 12 critical areas, and you will be absolutely awestruck by how I am when I reread it. You know, it's the 30th anniversary of Beijing, and I just looked at it recently again. I was awestruck by how relevant it is today. Now, specifically talking of aging bulges, there is the Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging, which is called MIPA, and it sort of lays out the practical actions for aging with dignity. Then we all know about the SDGs. And the SDGs are essentially also a standard framework because you have SDG 3, which is health, SDG 5, gender equality, SDG 10, which is reduced inequalities, all of which are directly relevant to the topic we're talking about. And they all have targets. Mm-hmm. And it was extremely hard for the world to agree to those targets, but they did. And now, you know, slowly people monitor how close they come to the targets, and it provides some sort of North Star. And finally, there are two more that I'll mention. One is the Pact for the Future, which was just negotiated last year, and that actually talks of gender equality and empowerment as a cross-cutting enabler. I mean, if you don't do gender equality, you can't reach the potential for everything else. And finally, most recently, there is a resolution of the Human Rights Commission, which has asked member states or asked the UN to support the drafting of a legally binding instruments for older persons' rights. So, you know, this entire multilateral framework actually serves as sort of a scaffolding for countries. And it addresses all aspects of a person's life. You know, there's nothing that's left out, really.
Yeah.
And so this is, to me, the uniqueness of the United Nations, which people often don't understand. And the multilateralism is as strong as the member states want, because the frameworks are negotiated by member states. But it's absolutely key. I mean, imagine a world where there are no negotiated standards. I'm not sure it would be great.
Yeah, thank you, Aparna. And I think your point about standard setting is incredibly important, but so too are, as you put it, you know, taking a holistic view and understanding what does the full scaffolding look like, the different pieces, how they relate to each other, and bringing them back to, I think, many of the key findings from the UNFPA report that Alessio laid out at the start of our conversation. Well, listen, I can't thank you both enough for joining us for this program. I'm afraid that's the time that we have for this opening segment. So let me thank you again, Alessio and Aparna, for joining us today and for the work that you are doing in your respective roles to not just help move things forward, but to do so equitably and based on evidence. It's now my pleasure to welcome an illustrious group of panelists to delve deeper into the issues that we've just been hearing about during this program. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Jose Miguel Guzman, President and founder of No Brainer Data, Dr. Samu Kaliso Dube, Executive Director of FP 2030, and Poonam Mutreja, Executive Director of the Population Foundation of India. Jose, Samu, and Poonam, thank you so much again for joining us and for helping us build upon the conversation that we've been having. Jose, I'd love to start with you. You're a demographer and data scientist, and I'd love to dig into the data with you a little bit. There's often a temptation to treat fertility decline in one country as the same as another, to paint the world with a broad brush, so to speak. But what does the data actually show? Can you help us understand which key factors, variables, and approaches are most overlooked when trying to understand population dynamics?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, this is a very important question. It's at the center of the discussion we are having now. I think we have a diversity, an important diversity in terms of fertility patterns, in terms of migration, in terms of mortality in different countries. We know, for example, that in Africa still, most of the country are still with fertility above the level of replacement, and probably they will be in that situation for some years ahead. They will be growing in terms of the population. And the other extreme, we have an increasing number of countries with very fertility, very low or low, in which things are completely different. But I think what we know in terms of high fertility country, we know a lot because we have been developing policy through the last 20, 30 years in countries with high fertility in trying to meet the demands of women in terms of make the decision about having kids a decision that is taken based on information and with the means to implement the decision to have or not to have kids. So I think we know very well that works and has been working in most of the country. But we are now facing a situation, the country with low fertility, that is, we don't know yet. And this is, I think, the most important challenge. So for me, the challenges in terms of high or low fertility is in terms of what we know about the cause of each of them and what we know in terms of which policy can work or not. We know, I think now the focus is in terms of policy and in terms of understanding is in very low and very low fertility countries. And I think we are failing catastrophically short in terms first on understanding what is the cause of that, and also in terms of the policy that we implement for that. So we don't know what explains the low fertility. We are saying that obviously material conditions are at the center of this decision, and because people want to have kids. Yes, this is true in some people, but what we see is that we see a very low fertility now being in every country that before was out of this situation. We have not only low fertility countries in Europe, in China, Japan, Korea, another Asian country, but we have also in the Caribbean, Dominica, Barbados, Montserrat, in Chile, in Colombia. In Chile, now the fertility rate is well below the fertility rate of Nordic countries, 1.13 in 2024. So this is the situation that I have to face. And the first thing we have to admit is that we don't know what is, we cannot understand what's happening. And the second one is that we don't have yet the policy that work.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it's really interesting to think about when paired with some of the insights that Alessio was sharing in terms of the mass survey that they conducted. But I think your point is well taken, that this is an incredibly complex issue, and we also know that the approaches that have been taken to date are clearly not working or working as well as they should be, especially when we think about people's aspirations, their needs, and their rights. And in many ways, that's a natural transition to a question that I had, Samu, for you, and as relates to family planning. We often hear that investing in family planning is one of the most cost-effective development strategies. And I know that this is something that FP 2030 has been working on for a very long time. Not only demonstrating and engaging with policymakers and communities about that, but also pushing it back against coercive or instrumentalist uses of family planning. So, Samu, can you share some specific examples where investments have translated into tangible gains for women in communities, investments in family planning that yield results beyond fertility outcomes?
Indeed. And good afternoon, Maisha and Maki and your team. Thank you so much for Foreign Policy for just putting a spotlight on this very important and yet complex issue. So before I answer your question, I wanted to just state that when we're talking about family planning, at the core of it, the ability for one person or individual or family to decide when and if they want to have children is a right. And ensuring that we enshrine that it's not just a developmental issue, but it is a right. That is important. What are we seeing in environments where governments have taken, or even NGOs have taken an initiative to invest more in family planning? I've got one powerful example for you here, Dr. Maisha, from Madagascar, where the Marine Conservation Group, I don't know whether you're familiar with them, Blue Ventures, they were doing some work in Madagascar where they discovered that women in coastal communities couldn't fully participate in conservation work. They lacked access to basic health services. And through that work with MSI, they helped bring contraceptive access, reducing access from 50 miles to 2 miles, ensuring that within a 2-mile radius, every woman has access to contraception. You know what happened? And the results are very striking. Women who used family planning earned twice as much income, and they were more likely to speak up in community decision making, and indeed playing a greater or even a stronger role in managing natural resources. You know, Madagascar relies on this a lot. That is very important because conservation efforts become more effective because communities broaden. They do need help, they need autonomy, they need opportunity, and these were being addressed by these women. We are seeing some emerging success stories in Kenya where contraceptive use significantly increased women's empowerment, leading to 10 to 12% rise in paid work. We've been talking, earlier around paid work, that women do not get involved as much in paid work. Now, investing in contraception ensures that women get paid more. And in Kenya, we saw that more than 14%, there was a more than 14% rise in control over their own money, over their own wages. In Senegal, there were investments in contraceptive supply chains that averted about 2,000 maternal deaths. Where else can you find such a return on investment? Because, Dr. Maisha, these outcomes don't just show up in fertility rates alone. They appear in classrooms, they appear in health clinics and community councils, etc., unlocking progress that we really need to see in areas that we highlighted earlier around, education and SDGs, etc. And that's why we say it's not just a health intervention, it's about rights and a development multiplier.
Yeah, I think that centering of rights is such an important piece, and in many ways, it's something that Poonam I wanted to touch upon with you about, which is that India has often been at the center of global population conversations, from coercive controls that take away agency and decision-making power in the past to recent debates around fertility decline and what that will mean in the future, even if projections show an increase in the coming decades. And so the question that I had for you is, what lessons does India offer the world about the consequences of ignoring women's agency and rights when it comes to population policy? Are there cautionary tales that we should be taking into account? And also, what are some lessons that we can take forward where things have worked well in India that, more broadly speaking, other regions and countries can learn from?
So, like much of the world, India has very divergent within the country. We have very divergent demographic realities. And while global population is projected to peak at around 10.4 billion in the 2080s, in India and many of the Asian countries, we are seeing a huge population decline. And this decline has come from women who didn't have agency. And often, yes, we've had what can be interpreted as a coercion in the 70s. But I can tell you, and given the importance that Aparna was giving to frameworks, India stood by the 1994 ICPD Cairo Plan of Action, which the UNFPA had very successfully organized. So I would like to say that in the last 2 or 3 decades, post-emergency, for which we had to pay a very high price of coercing family planning on both men and women, we've had a situation where in spite of lack of women's agency to a great extent, we've had the aspirations of women and girls and families have changed. And I think Jose referred to the changing patterns. What has worked in India is education. The literacy rates are much higher over the last 3 decades, 4 decades. We've made huge progress. And education, I'd like to say, is the strongest family planning pill, if you can call it. And in India, women are, they are so clear on how many children they want, and our data shows women in India do not wish to have more than 2 children. And so this huge unmet need, it is so tragic that we've had an unmet need of 18% fertility, for instance, in UP, 10% in parts of South India, is unwanted. But women in India even go through the difficult experience of going through an abortion. We have about 16 million abortions, more than 16 million. It's an underestimate every year, where women choose to go through abortion because they didn't have the agency to practice or access family planning services. So I would like to give a lot of credit to women for the fertility decline in India. And secondly, I'd like to really say that the government of India took FP 2020, which is now called FP 2030, very seriously, which is reaching additional women who did not have access to family planning services. And in India, one of the programs that I'd really like to mention the government did, which is they selected 140 high fertility districts, which had low education, poor indicators for women. And yet, because they focused on those 140 high fertility districts, and gave access to women, and the programming was well designed and defined, India's fertility declined very fast. And finally, I'd like to say that women, the coercion that women have had in India is that I would like to call it indirect coercion, that the focus has been on sterilization, and close to 70% of the family planning method is sterilization, and it is the women. What I'd like to see more in India, and it has happened post the FP 2020 commitments and ICPD commitments, on the basis of which India made its population policy in 2000. We've had an expansion of choices, but in a country which has such a large young population, if we had a greater choice in temporary methods, long-lasting methods, I think Indian women would be able to exercise their rights and have greater reproductive justice.
Thank you for that, Poonam. There's so many points that you covered, but there's 3 that stick out to me that I think are really important and apply beyond the context of India. The first is that point about subnational variation. Certainly in a country as large as India, that's true, but I think that's true in plenty of other regions and within countries as well. I think the second point that you made that's so important is as relates to the options available, right? It's not just about the right demographic, but also the choices that people have. And, you know, at the very end of your response, you were touching on the access to modern contraceptives and how that can really change and transform the decision making that individuals and families can make about their family size. And then the third point that you made that I think is so important is that whether somebody is having more children than they want or fewer children than they want, regardless, it's unmet need, right? And this is something Alessio also touched upon at the very beginning, and Samu, you did as well, that unmet need persists when it comes to family planning. And so the notion that we've somehow solved the family planning problem, so to speak, is just completely inaccurate. And there's something, Samu, that you touched upon earlier that I think is really important, and you brought it up during your example of Madagascar, but it applies in India, it applies through much of the world, which is how the issue of demographic change interacts with and is shaped by climate change. And I'd love to bring in an audience question. This is from Jeff de Sagna. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Apologies if not. Who's based in the US with an organization called Foresight Fight. And he asks, what is the deeper impact of climate anxiety on global reproductive choices, especially in the world's nations that are most threatened by climate change? So maybe Samu, we can go to you first, and then Poonam and Jose, welcome to bring you in as well. If you have any thoughts as relates to this linkage between the demographic shifts that we're talking about today and climate change and climate anxiety.
Thank you for that question, Dr. Maisha, and again from the audience for highlighting this. I think it is, first of all, it's not a fallacy as such, but we are deviating from a rights-based approach if we think that climate change is actually caused by overpopulation, and therefore we ought to initiate mechanisms that reduce population because of that, because we will be deviating from that person's ability to actually decide when they want to have children. At FP 2030 and working with our partners, what we believe in is that an approach that ensures that a person can plan when they want to have children and how many they want to have helps them to be resilient, Maisha, when some of these challenges that are related to climate change emerge, right? Because you are more able to plan, you are more able to bounce back stronger if you've got and you have actually maintained that ability to plan about your family. So it's about not just like mitigation and mitigating climate using population control measures, as people say, but ensuring that you invest in human development. If you invest in human beings, they do have that inherent ability to bounce back stronger. And there is no development without investing in family planning. So I think that needs to be made clear. So I think I would calm the anxiety, Maisha, by saying, our focus should not be on controlling, but our focus should be on investing in a rights-based approach to family planning.
Thank you for that, Samu. I think that's a clarion call to action that resonates, I'm sure, with many who are on this, not just program, but tuning in. Poonam, to you and Jose, if you just have any quick comments on this question about climate change and demographic change.
So having said earlier that globally and in India, women's choices and agencies do shape demographic futures of the world, I'd like to say that the anxiety that climate change is causing amongst a lot of people also leads to uncertainties. And we are seeing uncertainties all around us. And that is one factor where people are having fewer children, and especially in countries where there is a crisis of numbers, they don't have working age populations, etc. Second, when we think about the climate, we know the linkage between climate and reproductive health. And that is one, when there's crisis and when there are different crises that are resulting, whether it's flooding or droughts or whatever happens, it impacts women and their reproductive uh, access very sharply, but also we know due to climate change, there is a huge impact on whether it's men and their sperm counts or women's ability to have children, it's impacting. So there's a large number of families or couples who wish to have children, but because of infertility issues, they are not able to. And there's hardly a country in the world, very few countries, that are investing in infertility, governments investing in infertility. And especially for those countries where the largest number of women and poor women across Africa, India, who will never have the resources to go through fertility treatment. We need to make that part of our public health system. And finally, I'd say that women's health, when overall women's health gets impacted or people's health gets impacted, the ability to care for children, the elderly, and so on gets impacted. So climate change is disproportionately impacting women. And finally, I do want to absolutely agree with Semo about the rights-based approach. Women have the right to have children if they want, if they have experiencing infertility or do not have access to family planning, or if they wish to have children. But the biggest challenge for women is today the overburden, the lack of childcare, and governments are putting the burden on women, whether it's in Russia, China, India. There are conversations about putting the burden on pressure, should I say, also women to have more children, ignoring the reasons people are delaying or avoiding parenthood, such as economic insecurity, climate insecurity, unpaid care burdens, and lack of childcare. And finally, given that disproportionately women are impacted, we continue to see that men don't play a role in caregiving or supporting women.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I thank you for that. Jose, over to you on this question about climate and demographic change. Eager to hear what your perspective is.
Well, I'm trying to think in terms of the question, what exactly the person that asked this question was trying to get from us. I appreciate that he or she made this question. I think climate change is one of the things that are affecting the decision of everyone, even they want it or not, even if they say that or not. We are seeing what's happening. People are looking at the impacts, and this is part of the equation that people put in the table when they are trying to take any decision: buy a house, have a kid, move to another country. This thing will be increasingly incorporated in the mapping of all the factors that can make things good or bad for somebody when they take a decision. What happened is the following. When for example, in terms of having or married or have a kid or not, those are decisions that are taken in a context in which the society has created a situation in which kids are not necessary for survival. You can have no kids, and that's fine. You are not going to die because of that. Maybe there is a lot of things that will change in terms of supporting older ages, etc. But this is something that is because, and this is why the economist Nobel Prize Gary Becker said about how the fertility decisions are taken. And actually, even if he didn't say, the current economy that we have lead to zero fertility. Why to have kids? So the question is why people are not having kids. The question is why you should have kids. And then when you ask that question in this way, then you say, okay, I will build in a future with my kids. I will provide him or her with education. I will do this and that. But if all the question that you make is a negative, give you a negative answer, there is no way you can build a project for your life based on that. So climate change has an underlying cause in the framework of all the factors that make people think twice when they will be taking the decision having or not having kids. I don't think it is an issue. We can talk about climate change and population, those links, but I don't think this is the issue. When I ask young people, this is what the first thing that they told me is, climate change, how are we going to have these kids? Well, now they are incorporating other things like the labor force. So the labor force a scenario that we have in which people are student, doing a lot of study in very good college and university. At the end, they are thinking that maybe they will have no jobs. So I think the context in which we are is creating an environment that is part of this for the decision.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. And I think one of the recurring themes of today's conversation has been how complex and multifactorial this decision making is. But I also think, as Samu and Poonam alluded to, certainly in plenty of communities, the impacts of climate change are not just being felt, but very much front and center when it comes to unmet needs around family planning and decisions about fertility. So I appreciate, again, all of your perspectives on this, and I would love to be able to continue this conversation with you, but I'm afraid that's the time that we have for this segment of our program. So thank you again, Jose, Samu, and Poonam, for your perspectives and insights, and for joining us today and making time for this discussion.
Thank you, Maisha.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha.
Pleasure.
Now, in terms of where do we go from here, I'm really excited to conclude today's program with a conversation with Kathleen Mogelgaard, who is President and CEO of the Population Institute and our partner for this virtual dialogue. Kathleen, we have had so many different topics and issues come up over the course of this conversation, and I'm really excited to bring you into the discussion and have an opportunity to pull some of those threads and pieces together. Kathleen, welcome.
Thank you so much. It is great to be here. And I want to say again, happy World Population Day to everyone who has joined us for this conversation. This is the perfect conversation for us to be having on World Population Day to really reflect on population trends, what they mean for people today, what they mean for the future, how they relate to so many other key dimensions of the world that we live in. So I'm just really grateful to foreign policy and to all of the speakers who have joined us for this really rich conversation today.
And thank you, Kathleen. And as you just said rightly, it's really an important milestone and an opportunity for reflection. And today's discussion during this program has been far-reaching. So I'd like to ask you first, as you reflect on today's conversation, what key messages do you believe are most urgent for leaders across the globe to take away when it comes to understanding and addressing population trends through policies, public investments, and partnerships?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Maisha. And I think for me, when I reflect on the themes that have come out from today's conversations and what we would like to take away as some of the key messages, for me, one of the big ones is that despite what we see in the headlines today, we are not on the verge of population collapse globally. Often what we see in the media either oversimplifies or mischaracterizes this really complex and nuanced demographic moment that we are living through. A number of our speakers today have talked about the diversity of demographic trends around the world. And I think that is really important for us to take away from this conversation today, is that we live in a demographically diverse world, and that when we look at demographic trends, we need to understand what is behind them. That population often is focused on numbers, but behind every number, of course, is a person. And that is a person who is living in the context of a very multi-sectoral world, and understanding that person's lived experience and how that adds up to the particular population trends that that person is living within is different in every place around the world. And we should be thinking about policies and programs that can respond to that person's needs and the way those needs fit into the broader systems in which they are embedded.
Yeah, and as I listen to you speak, I'm really struck by what you said about alarmism and this panic that can mischaracterize what the complex realities are. And as you just alluded to, and we've heard over and over again today, demographic challenges are not about numbers alone. The numbers are really important; they tell us a lot, but demographic challenges and reproductive agency is also about rights and choice and equity and opportunity. And so, as you look at that, the way in which, as you put it, oftentimes there's either an alarmism or mischaracterization or oversimplification. Let me ask you this: how can we shift policy and public discussions away from fear-based narratives and towards solutions that center people and their rights, especially for women and girls, but also for men and boys?
It's a terrific question. And I think that what it points toward is the need for us to be asking different kinds of questions and to look at the long view, both sort of the historic long view and the long view that we are looking toward for the future that we want to create. When we look over the long view of history, we can see that after a very dramatic phase of global population expansion, we are beginning to see some shifts. There have been declines in fertility globally over the last 40 to 50 years. We can look at that as a sign of progress. We can look at that as a success story that we have been able to have investments that enable people to live longer, richer lives, that enable women to enter the workforce, that enable girls to get an education, that enable people to avoid unintended pregnancy, that we've been able to address in a lot of places, adolescent pregnancy that was threatening the health and well-being of girls and newborns and their economic prospects for the future. So we've seen a lot of success that is behind the shifts in fertility over the last many decades. We also need to remember, though, that that job is not yet finished. As a
Yeah.
number of our panelists have talked about today, there remain deep needs for hundreds of millions of women and girls around the world to meet their needs for determining whether and when they want to be a parent and to have access to the information and services that enable them to achieve their childbearing desires. So it is really important that we not be completely distracted by the conversation around depopulation, and we remember that we have not yet finished the job for women and girls around the world who still lack meaningful access to the information and services that would enable them to have the family size that they would like.
Thank you for that, Kathleen. And we are almost out of time, but I want to just pick up on that last piece and ask you one final question, maybe very, very briefly, but I think it's an important one, which is, there's often a gap between what the data tells us and what drives political decisions and funding decisions. And I know this is something that you all at the Population Institute are very focused on. And so let me ask you this: how can advocates and institutions bridge that gap and ensure that population-related investments reflect both evidence and ethics?
It's a terrific question, and it is an extremely important one for the moment that we are living through right now, demographically and politically. I think it's really critical that we not forget the focus of evidence-based decision making when it comes to our conversations and the policies that we have in this moment that we are living through, from this demographically diverse moment that we are living through. We need to really continue to center the rights of people in our conversation, bring the evidence that so many of our panelists have brought forward today in terms of what we know about people and their ability to access the services that they need for their childbearing decision making. And we need to be completely honest about the ways in which financing for these services and for this information, um, how we're not living up to our commitments that we have made to really robustly invest in the health
Hmm.
and well-being of women and girls around the world. We need to be able to marry the data with the conversation on rights and the conversation around commitments that all countries have made toward ensuring that women and girls around the world have access to services and information to enable to achieve their childbearing desires.
Thank you for that, Kathleen, and again for connecting those pieces so eloquently. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have, I'm afraid. So thank you again to all of our panelists and speakers. Thank you to Kathleen for this concluding conversation. And a huge thanks to the Population Institute for supporting this project, this initiative, today's virtual dialogue, as well as the Insight Brief, which you can access via the screen that you're looking at right now or on FP Analytics' website. I'd also like to just conclude by mentioning that please do join us for our upcoming events, including FP's series of forums, roundtables, and simulations on everything from emerging tech, the energy transition, food security, and global health. Many of these programs will be happening alongside the UN General Assembly in September. One event that today's viewers may be particularly interested in is our annual Her Power Summit, which brings together women leaders and leaders from across government, business, and international organizations. This will be a program that will be in person in New York, as well as live streamed to our global audience. You can learn much more about these and other events at foreignpolicy.com/events. All right, take care, see you soon, and happy Population Day, everybody, World Population Day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Great moderation, Maisha.
Hi, everybody. Thank you again so much.